In my last video I looked at some top CO2 facts by Ivor Cummins, which he quite openly admits he simply copied off a website run by a fossil fuel lobby group. In that video I debunked some of the top 10 facts, which claimed that life was wonderful and booming during the Jurassic and the Cambrian, when CO2 was much higher. If you haven't seen it yet, do take a look. In this video I'll look at the other theme of the top 10, which is that if we get more CO2, we get more plants, and that's a good thing for all of us. So, what's fact number 3, Ivor?
Fact 3. First and foremost, CO2 is plant food. If you increase CO2 from 150 ppm in the greenhouse up to 300 and up to 450, which is where we are now in the world with a greening world, you get much more plant growth.
Ivor's source, of course, is this website run by a fossil fuel lobby group called the CO2 Coalition. We'll call it the Coalition for short. But what the Coalition never mentions are all the other inputs that plants need that are equally deserving of the term plant food, like minerals and sunlight and the right soil and a favourable temperature range, and let's not forget water. But before I go on, I spotted something Ivor Cummins got right, so he deserves a for saying,
with a greening world,
because the Earth is indeed greening. Unfortunately for the critics, this isn't a slap in the face of climate science, because this greening was predicted decades ago. It's been confirmed in studies by researchers around the world, and I've spoken about it in several videos, including this one. Around half of the carbon we release is absorbed by the oceans and the biosphere, and half accumulates in the atmosphere. Good for plant growth, because plants depend on carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Experiments have shown that plants grow much better in higher concentrations of CO2, which is why nurseries often pump CO2 into greenhouses. Higher CO2 also allows plants to open their pores less widely, which means they won't lose so much water to evapotranspiration. About 10% of the CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere goes into the biosphere, the trees, bushes and grasslands of the world. Most of it is happening at higher latitudes, where the tundra is turning into forest. A lot of the greening in the rest of the world isn't related to crops at all. It's what non-biologists would call weeds, because anyone who's done any gardening knows that weeds don't need a lot of nurturing. What we want to know is whether this greening will be good for us. Will it mean more growth in the things we want, not bushes and weeds, but food? And here's where you really need to pay attention, because although CO2 is plant food makes a great bumper sticker, the real world is a lot more complicated than
CO2 plant food good.
Let's start with the Coalition's source, which is another blog called CO2 Science, run by Craig Idso. He received funding from the Western Fuels Association about 20 years earlier to produce a report called The Greening of the Planet Earth, and the report in his blog seems to be an update of that. But the fact that he's been funded by the fossil fuel industry doesn't matter, as long as he doesn't cherry-pick or change the information he's reporting. You can probably guess where this is heading. One of the sources that both the CO2 Coalition and CO2 Science use is a 1995 paper by Dippery et al., which we saw in the last video. So if I cite the same paper, there shouldn't be any accusations that it's fake science and part of a worldwide conspiracy. As I showed in my last video, some plants, called C4, use a different type of photosynthesis, so the concentration of CO2 is not that important for them. It's much more important for C3 plants. The study looked at growth in a typical C3 plant with carbon dioxide at 150 parts per million, what you could call CO2 near starvation levels, then at 270, the level at which most of recorded history has taken place, then at 350 parts per million, the CO2 concentration in 1995 when the study was done, and finally 700 parts per million, which is double that. The authors found that by adding 200 parts per million from near starvation level to 1995 level, they got a huge increase in growth of 230%. But adding a lot more than that, another 350 parts per million, resulted in only a 22% increase in growth. So growth tapers off the more CO2 you add. We can see that more clearly by plotting CO2 concentration against plant growth recorded by the study. The authors also ran the same experiment for a typical C4 plant and found almost no difference in growth rate, regardless of CO2 concentration. These huge different growth rates are important to remember when we look at the next so-called fact.
Fact 8, more CO2 means more plant growth. And again, this is a repeat, but it's just some figures here showing the various plants, beans, tubers, etc. That get massive increase in growth.
Yeah, just some figures here. Let's not worry about where they come from or how accurate they are. Wait, no, let's not be Ivor Cummins. Let's check these figures. They apparently show the growth in crops. If we add another 300 parts per million to our atmosphere, that would take us up to 720 parts per million. But the figures look incredibly high based on the study we've just looked at, that Craig Idso cited. So where do they come from? Two sources for the figures are shown. One is Gregory Wrightsone, an executive director at the CO2 Coalition, who owns a fossil fuel consulting business. He's also a member of an evangelical group that believes we should use all of the resources of creation that God gave us. But most importantly, there's no record of any scientific study by him in 2017 or any other year. And since published studies don't normally have copyright next to them, this is either a book or an essay or a blog, which pretty much amount to the same thing. No basis for his figures is cited. And the other source is, again, Craig Idso and his CO2 science blog. Funny thing is, here he's claiming growth rates of 40 to 70%, even though the experiment he and the coalition cited elsewhere shows growth of only around 22%. What gives? Well, put yourself in Craig Idso's shoes for a minute. The study was done when CO2 concentration was 350 parts per million, close to the current level of 418. But that doesn't show the fastest growth rate. Ideally, he wants to take the growth rate here and put it here, making people think it starts at 350. He has to figure out a way of doing that without making a claim that's an obvious lie. Well, here's an idea. What if he doesn't mention the starting point at all? Hide all this and just say adding 200 parts per million or adding 350 parts per million without telling people what the starting point is. Word it carefully so they then assume he's talking about growth rate from current levels. Hey, no fault of his if they jump to the wrong conclusion. And that's exactly what Craig Idso did. He tells us this is what happens when we add 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide, but makes no mention of what it's being added to. And the CO2 Coalition simply copies that. We get the impression here, and also in the title, that this is the kind of plant growth we're expecting to see as we add more CO2 to our atmosphere. Clever, huh? But to confirm that he really did cherry-pick the lowest level of CO2 as his starting point, I had to check his sources. For example, Idso cites a study by Cunniff et al. Looking at plant growth for 180, 280 and 380 parts per million CO2. As the paper explains, this represents CO2 levels at the low point during the last glaciation, during the post-glacial period, which includes recorded human history, and at the time of the research, respectively. The authors conclude, an increase in CO2 from glacial to post-glacial levels caused a significant gain in vegetative biomass of up to 40%. But the equivalent rise in CO2 from post-glacial to modern levels generally had no effect on biomass. So the two results were 40% plant growth under post-glacial conditions and no growth under conditions of the last 200 years. But when citing the study, Idso only reports the 40% growth result. Here's what he writes. The results revealed that the 100 parts per million increase in CO2 from glacial to post-glacial levels, 180 to 280 parts per million, caused a significant gain in vegetative biomass of up to 40%, together with other benefits. But no mention of what else the study revealed, that this phenomenal growth flattens out after 280 parts per million. And in the summary, the starting point is completely missing. So yes, this so-called fact not only used cherry-picked data to manufacture an artificially high growth rate, but also hides the CO2 starting point, so that it looks as though the same growth rate applies in the immediate future. I think that really is, as Ivor Cummins calls it, taking the mickey.
Don't be taking the mickey here.
Anyway, now that we've debunked the cherry picking, we can deal with the real growth figures that are going to affect us. They're still pretty impressive. After all, nearly all the studies do show growth in C3 plants when you add further CO2 to current levels, even though it's far less spectacular than what you would get starting at 150 parts per million. We'll take the study the Coalition cites as an example. As we saw, Dippery 95 found growth of 22% when it doubled CO2 concentration from 350 to 700 parts per million. If we do what the Coalition recommends and continue burning coal and oil at the same rate, we'll hit 700 parts per million in about 140 years. So, a 22% plant growth, starting at 350 parts per million in 1995, as the experiment did, represents about a 0.13% increase in crop yield every year. But these kinds of experiments were carefully controlled. The plants were kept close to ideal temperatures and given all the water and nutrients they needed, because the aim was to study the effects of CO2 as the only variable. In the real world, crops will be affected by other factors. One is heat stress. That's not only a problem during the day. One of the characteristics of global warming through an increase in greenhouse gases is that nights also get warmer, so when plants suffer from higher daytime temperatures, they don't get the chance to recover at night. Add to that salinization, which is already affecting crop yields in many parts of the world, and shrinking glaciers and snow, which reduce summer irrigation that millions of farmers depend on, and limitations on available nutrients like phosphorus in tropical and subtropical climates, and, as we've seen, the growth of weeds, which are the bane of farmers everywhere, and the huge increase of changing rainfall patterns as hotter temperatures increase evaporation and warmer air holds more moisture. The crops we grow are very sensitive to the amount of water they receive, whether too much or too little. Of course, scientific studies have been warning about this for decades, but it's sometimes hard to get the point across to people who don't read or understand scientific studies. So to illustrate the point, I looked for a news report showing crop damage caused by drought from this year, and I found one, and then another one, and then more.
Farmers are feeling the heat as yields are a fraction of normal levels. Italian rice farmers, for example, are expected to lose 30 to 50% of their yields this year as paddy fields dry up.
Walking through his field of stunted corn, farmer Adriano Tugnolo, the son and grandson of corn growers, shows us the damage wrought by the drought.
Marka inkastoo tahay anigoon bawligay tanoo kala arkin lo eri waxaan lahayn hatta geel wax joogo male waa dhamaadeen xoolihii.
Ranchers in the Midwest are in the middle of battling through one of the worst droughts in the last 100 years. Current hay yield is about 25% of what it should be.
Most of the Midwest is abnormally dry.
They're showing up the worst I've ever seen.
But without enough rain this summer,
really dry, really sad.
Their farmers market has had just one vegetable farmer.
So that's been really, really sad. We have been the only farmer at the market with vegetables at all.
Hot months since the East Nusa Tenggara region has seen rain. These once fertile rice fields are now terraces of parched dirt. Thousands of hectares in the Prabakul village in the East Sumba district have been destroyed by drought.
The rain stopped in May this year. We haven't been able to plant anything since then. We need help from the government. We have to ration our food because the rice that we have is not enough to consume like on normal days.
It's been so hot this year, you can almost see it. The ground here bone dry.
Yeah, it's extremely dry. A lot of this is last year's growth, and it should be lush green, and you should be very hard to tell what last year's growth was. So again, really nothing for the cattle to graze on this year.
This is the driest he's ever seen in 80 years of farming.
Governments are calling the conditions catastrophic, unlike anything that's been seen before.
Vineyards are parched. Red and green grapes are shriveling up as a result of Spain's long, intense drought.
Al sep sa mort, Pensem que és un set de 30 anys que té unes arrels molt profundes i amb aquesta sequera el que no ha arribat és l'aigua a les arrels.
This year's drought has devastated the fruits. Last year, this farmer lost 75% of his crop.
Very dry days with a water shortage have led to lighter, smaller fruit.
前期雨很少，去年种的包我家不什么，一路的小棵，但是没有下多的雨，包括的有的干死了，有的还有一点，对不对？
这买种上之后下过雨吗？
买了都没下过雨，都下了会儿小雨。
I'm recording this at the end of 2023, and these were all news reports from this year. Of course, those who don't want to accept climate science, for whatever reason, will be outraged at this montage, and they're already writing furious posts saying, we can't blame global warming for these droughts, and even if we could, we can't blame CO2 for global warming. And hold on, just calm down. The point I'm making, which the Coalition and Ivor Cummins failed to mention, is that CO2 is not the only thing plants need for healthy growth. They also need water and the right range of temperatures. I'm sure that if you go up to one of these farmers and say, well, look on the bright side, at least your crops are being helped by more CO2, I'm sure you'd brighten their day, because farmers are notoriously cheerful and optimistic people. But the obvious point is that while extra CO2 is indeed a positive for plant growth, there are also a lot of negatives that need to be taken into account, which the Coalition doesn't challenge, because it doesn't even mention them. As we've seen, their mission statement is to promote CO2 and fossil fuels, so it's hardly surprising they missed all this out. But that's even less excuse to use this as a source and simply read from it as if it were gospel.
Fact 9, more CO2 helps to feed more people worldwide, and this kind of follows on from the last one, and grain production is breaking records.
But there's no evidence that this increase in grain production is due to CO2. Grain production has been rising since 1961 because of other factors that are well known, like the Green Revolution in the 1960s, more widespread use of fertilizers and farm machinery, the introduction of genetic modification, and the fact that as the world's population grows, more land has come under cultivation. So I think that definitely deserves a...
Don't be taking the mickey here.
Of course, instead of taking this in and realizing they've been duped, a lot of people are going to look past all these errors and misrepresentations and give the what about excuse, like what about fact number 12? Or what about fact number 25? It would be great if I had a huge budget and a staff of 20 people to do all the fact-checking, script writing and editing. I'd be able to roll out a video every week and debunk the entire list in about 8 months. Unfortunately, there's just me and my laptop computer, and as much time as I can spare. But what I can do is encourage all of you what about critics to fact-check this stuff yourselves. Even if you're not the least bit skeptical of anything you read on the internet, at least you've now seen that most of the top 10 is either misleading or just plain wrong. The reason I know that and you know that is because your only answer is not to address any of the so-called facts that I've debunked, but to switch to a what about. So please go through all the other facts on the list and try to be a skeptic by asking yourself, is this a fact or is it an opinion? Using words that are undefined, vague and subjective. If it's a fact, what's the source? Is it misrepresenting or cherry-picking information from the source? And if the fact does turn out to be correct, what point is it making, if any? How does that change what we already know? Is it leaving out crucial information in order to create a false impression? To start you off, I'll run through the next series of facts very quickly. When you hear the fact, try pausing the video and see if you can debunk it yourself, and see if I debunked it the same way. Should be fun.
Fact 2. The warming effect of each molecule of CO2 declines as its concentration increases.
I'm not sure what point they're making, and they don't say. It's called a logarithmic scale. As shown in scientific studies, it forms the basis of all temperature projections. According to this logarithmic scale, every time we double CO2 concentration, the temperature will rise by about 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That's around 3 degrees centigrade. But it's nice to know that the Coalition accepts this, I guess.
Fact 10. Modern warming began more than 300 years ago.
What's the source? None given. Where did they get the figures from? Doesn't say. So why not claim the warming started in 1875? That seems to fit their squiggly black line a lot better. And who drew this squiggly line anyway? Turns out the CO2 Coalition did, and it doesn't fit with any reproduction of average global temperature over the last 300 years. So that isn't a fact, it's an opinion based on a made-up reconstruction and an arbitrary starting point.
Fact 11. Melting glaciers confirm modern warming predated increases of CO2.
Come on, what about people? You should know what to do here. Check the source. Does it say what the Coalition claims? No. It turns out it says the opposite. There was a strong increase in glacial retreat starting at the end of the 19th century. Erlemans calculates what atmospheric temperature would have been required to cause such glacial retreats for each region, and that gives an average global mean. He says it fits very well with other temperature reconstructions, and they all match the rise in CO2 concentration. Histograms of mean retreat rates for selected periods show that few glaciers in the sample actually became longer. For the period from 1860 to 1900, one glacier advanced and all the others retreated. For the period from 1900 to 1980, 142 of the 144 glaciers retreated.
Fact 12. Rising sea levels confirm modern warming predated increases CO2.
The CO2 Coalition cites a paper by Gevrejeva et al., which, of course, doesn't confirm any such thing. In fact, it says the key components of sea level, melting of glaciers and thermal expansion of the ocean, provide evidence of acceleration since 1800.
Fact 13. Temperatures changed dramatically during the past 10,000 years even.
And it wasn't us. But this reconstruction, based on research led by Richard Alley, does not show average global temperature over the last 10,000 years. It's the temperature at one location on Greenland up to 1855. So whoever wrote in this line and date of 2007, it certainly wasn't the authors of the study, has created a completely phony graph. If we add in temperature data averaging the first decade of the 21st century, for that region of Greenland, it would put the temperature in 2007 right up here. But that's still the temperature at just one location in Greenland. If we take a look at average global temperatures over the last 10,000 years, then fact number 10 looks very different. Temperatures have only moved about 0.5 degrees centigrade during that time, and have only changed dramatically over the last 150 years, with a sharp upward spike coinciding with the Industrial Revolution and the rise in CO2 concentration. So yes, the only dramatic change we've seen during the past 10,000 years very clearly was us, or more accurately, it was the rise in CO2 that came from the burning of fossil fuels.
Fact 14. Interglacials usually last 10,000 to 15,000 years.
No, they don't. They vary in length because the most likely cause is Milankovitch cycles, and these relate to a number of different factors in the Earth's tilt, spin and orbit. The absurd thing is that the Coalition is making this fatuous claim while they're showing an interglacial that anyone can see from this scale is a lot longer than 10,000 years. This is the Hoxnean or Holstein interglacial, which lasted about 50,000 years. The Purfleet interglacial lasted more than 30,000 years. The best fit for the current interglacial suggests it would last about another 16,000 years.
So fact 15, the last interglacial was 8 degrees warmer than today. Polar bears survived, Greenland didn't melt.
Of course it wasn't warmer than today, let alone 14 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Stop reading this stuff out as if it's the infallible word of the Bible. Just check their source. The 2013 study by Dahl Jensen et al. Wasn't measuring average global temperature, it was measuring the temperature at one location in the north of Greenland. And it wasn't measuring the temperature of the last interglacial, it was measuring the temperature of the warmest part of the last interglacial. And it wasn't comparing it with temperatures today, it was comparing it with the average over the last 1,000 years.
Fact 16, the current warming trend is neither unusual nor unprecedented.
But this is the same phony graph that we've already seen does not represent global temperature and has been doctored to misrepresent recent temperatures. When you look at average global temperatures over the last 10,000 years, it's clear that the current warming trend is both unusual and unprecedented.
Fact 17, and don't worry, we're nearly finished. The current warming trend is neither unusual nor unprecedented. Part 2. And here we have 1,000 up to 2000 AD.
No, not up to 2000 AD. It says the data ends in 1979. It's right there. And since the data ends in 1979, which is here, you're missing all the warming of the last 43 years. So this isn't the current warming trend. If you include it, then of course the current warming is unusual and unprecedented.
Fact 18, Earth's orbit and tilt drive glacial interglacial changes.
But we're not in a glacial-interglacial change, so the Milankovitch cycle has nothing to do with recent warming. I'm running out of time here, but if you've been trying your hand at fact-checking ahead of me, how did you get on? Surely even the whatabouters can see that when you start checking facts, you begin to understand why these claims are nonsense. But while most of the posters on Ivor Cummins' video were happy to pay him to read the stuff aloud, one of his followers actually was sceptical enough to question the source. So there's hope yet. And don't forget the charity which I ask you to support in lieu of a Patreon account. It's an innovative scheme that trades healthcare for preserving rainforests, resulting in a huge reduction in deforestation and an increase in health. Details are in the video description, as always.